The windows were blacked out, the doors locked. No men allowed, not even the king. No sunlight, no fresh air, no escape. Only flickering candlelight and the heavy breath of incense. Somewhere behind the silence, a woman screamed. This wasn't a dungeon. It was a birthing chamber in Tudor England. Royal birth was not a moment of celebration. It was a national ritual, a political performance, a sacred torment. And at its center was a queen stripped of power, identity, even her name. They called it confinement, but it was a living burial for 6 weeks before delivery. The queen was sealed away, swallowed by tapestries depicting saints and sorrow, drenched in sacred oil, forbidden music, forbidden mirth. Mirrors were covered, a fire burned at all hours. The air turned thick and strange. Midwives whispered prayers in Latin, and always the door remained shut, because birth was not natural. It was supernatural. It was dangerous. It was watched. The fate of an entire dynasty curled inside her womb. Was it a son, a savior, a stillborn omen? She did not know. She was not allowed to know. She could only wait while rumors grew like mold just outside the chamber walls. Some claimed to hear chanting, others sobbing. Some said the queen had already died and the child would be born to a corpse. Others claimed the child wasn't even the king's, but all agreed on one thing. Whatever happened behind that door would shape the future of England, and what happened was not always holy. This is the story of the rituals the Tudors performed during royal births, of the blood, the silence, the candles, the confinement, of the crown that demanded not just heirs, but obedience, of the women who bore more than just children. They bore the burden of a kingdom's fear. So before the cries of new life filled the air, there was darkness, there was dread, and there was a queen locked away. As the world waited to see whether she would give birth to glory or to ghosts. But before the cries came, the room was sealed. She was crowned to rule, dressed in jewels, flanked by trumpets. But once the crown settled and the cheers faded, she became something else entirely, a vessel in the Tudor world. Queens were not women. They were wombs wrapped in velvet, the health of the monarchy, the fate of its bloodline, its wars, its treaties depended on whether a woman could produce a boy. Not just any boy, a legitimate male heir. One who cried at the right time, under the right star, before the wrong whispers could take hold. And so, from the moment a queen was married, every part of her life was recalibrated. Her diet, her sleep, her movement, her pulse became a political matter. Her morning sickness was royal news. Her swelling belly, a prophecy. But pregnancy wasn't private. It was a state event. Her bed was examined. Her breath was monitored. Her urine sniffed by court physicians. Even her cravings were interpreted like omens, a desire for pears, sign of a peaceful reign, blood in her spit, a curse. She was surrounded always by women, chosen not for trust, but for loyalty to the throne. Midwives who answered not to her, but to Parliament. Noble ladies who smiled, but watched. Every stitch of fabric, every herb she consumed, every shadow that passed her chamber door dash scrutinized the dot, because a royal baby was a weapon. A girl could destroy alliances. A miscarriage could shake the crown. A rumor of adultery could trigger execution, and she knew it. So she smiled, she obeyed. She carried England inside her like a stone and prayed it would not sink her. Yet, beneath the silks and sanctity, terror festered. How many had come before her and failed? How many queens had delivered nothing but grief? How many had watched their husbands slip away toward mistresses, court, Parliament, toward Galazand, known they were to blame for being barren? This was not motherhood, it was monarchy. Kent. Monarchy did not forgive weakness. She was the heart of the kingdom. but the kingdom had sharp teeth. Once her belly began to show, the real performance began. Not a celebration, not a tender nesting of mother and child, but a ritual, rigid, chilling, sacred to some, superstitious to most. It was called the lying in, a practice both blessed and cursed. On a designated day chosen by astrologers, sanctioned by bishops, the queen was locked away, secluded, removed from the world she once ruled. The doors were shut, curtains drawn, mirrors covered, tapestries rearranged to block evil spirits. Even the floor was relayed with sacred herbs. Men were banned, light was dimmed, laughter was frowned upon, no sharp objects allowed, no knots in the room, because a knotted cord, they said, could tie the womb. And so began a long, dark silence. For 6 weeks or more, the queen remained sealed in this chamber, her own gilded prison, surrounded only by whispered prayers, flickering candlelight, and women who spoke in riddles. Some called it holy, others called it hell. For a woman already in pain, swollen, breathless, and frightened, this was not safety. It was suspense. Each night, the air grew heavier. Superstition seeped in through the seams of her mattress. A servant spilled salt, bad omen, a dream of blood, witchcraft. A sudden scream from the courtyard, an ill-omened bird. Her body became a battleground. She prayed, not for joy, but for survival. Not just her own, but the child's, the crown's, the realm's. Because should she fail, she would not just be pitied, she would be blamed. No heir, no security, no queen. This ritual, this sacred confinement was not for her protection. It was for the monarchy's control. The woman who entered was royal. The woman who emerged would be something else, either a savior or a shadow. Behind velvet curtains, power waits not with a sword, but with a cradle. When the moment came, it did not arrive with ceremony. It arrived with blood, with trembling, with sheets torn by fingernails. The midwives entered like priests to a sacrifice gum, trained, silent. They were not here for comfort. They were here for a result. No husbands allowed, no physicians unless summoned at the brink. Just women and walls, thick enough to muffle screams. And scream she did. The queen, once bowed to, worshipped, and adored, was now reduced to a creature of pain. Her legs spread, her hair damp, her crown somewhere outside these walls, irrelevant now. This was not birth. It was battle. Every moan echoed like judgment. Every drop of blood, a possible omen. And hovering over it all was the question that burned hotter than any fever. Was it a boy? Hours, sometimes days, she labored. Prayers whispered, some read. Talismans placed on her belly. The slightest shift in her breathing caused panic. And when the child finally emerged wet, purple, gasping no, one cheered. Not yet. The umbilical cord was severed. The room went silent. A midwife inspected. Another crossed herself. And then finally, the word was spoken. It is the son. Cheers erupted beyond the door. Bells rang. Nobles wept. Fireworks were prepared. But inside that chamber, the queen bled. Her body shivered with exhaustion. A tea, and the midwives, sole solemn keepers of Tudor, Screts gleaned her quietly, efficiently, for they knew the truth. Some royal babies were stillborn, Dan replaced in silence. Some cries were faked. Some mothers were told lies. A midwife's loyalty was to the crown, not the woman. And sometimes a dead baby girl vanished, and a living boy was presented instead. Because history does not remember pain. It remembers names, heirs, lineage, and if blood had to be hidden to preserve the throne, so be it. The cradle rocked not with love, but with strategy. The birthing chamber wasn't a place of life. It was a prison. A gilded cell lined with superstition, silence, and salt. Once the queen's belly began to swell, She was locked away for a month before birth. The windows were covered in heavy drapes. The candles never went out. Mirrors were removed. No men allowed. No light allowed. No God allowed to witness what came next. They called it lying in. It was more like dying in. The air grew thick, stale. The only breeze was the one inside her lungs, shallow and panicked. The room was made dark, not for privacy, but for magic. They believed too much light might weaken the womb or invite evil spirits to steal the child. She could not leave. She could not walk the halls. She could only wait while the world watched her from the outside. And all the while, whispers crept under the door. Will it be a boy? Will she survive this one? Will God curse the Tudor line again? Some queens went mad during confinement. Some hallucinated saints in the shadows. Others heard dead babies crying through the stone walls. And when labor began, the room transformed into a theater of suffering. No anesthesia, privacy, linen soaked in wine, and screams muffled by scripture. Sometimes they cut her. Sometimes they used forceps. Sometimes the child was turned inside her body by hand, and when she tore, when the queen bled from places no one dared name, there was no dignity, no royalty, no divine right left, just flesh, agony, a woman trapped inside a ritual made for men. And still, if the child was not male, it was as if the suffering never counted. The crown needed sons, not survivors. In Tudor England, a queen's body was not her own. It was the throne's. Her womb, a battlefield. Her pain, a footnote. The first sound should have been a cry, but in some rooms, it was a curse. For even when a baby survived the brutal rite of Tudor birth, the danger was far from over. Midwives huddled around the wet body, whispering prayers. One would hold a candle near the child's lips to check for breath. Another would press a crucifix to its forehead. The mother was forgotten, bleeding, broken, trembling while all eyes turned to the new piece of political currency. If the baby moved, they rejoiced. If the baby didn't, they baptized the corpse in haste lest it burn forever in limbo. Sometimes the queen wasn't told if it was stillborn. Sometimes she was told it was a boy, only for a girl to be buried before dawn. The stakes were too high. For honesty, because a queen who failed to produce a son was no queen at all. She was a liability, a bad omen, a body not fit to carry God's will into the world. And yet, even a successful birth brought dread. The child was often taken away, immediately raised by wet nurses, guarded by courtiers, poisoned by politics. Queen rarely held her own baby more than once. They were hers only in theory. In truth, they belonged to England, and then came the rituals to protect them. They hung charms made of wolf's teeth around cradles, burned rosemary in royal chambers, rubbed infants with oils, and recited ancient rhymes to guard against the evil. A curse they believed could kill a prince with just a gaze. They feared witches, changelings, and demons. But they never feared the system that made women suffer like this. They feared the curse, but not the crown that demanded its price. To be born royal in Tudor England was not a blessing. It was a performance, and sometimes a death sentence. Some were wrapped in silk, others in rags. All were buried in silence. When a royal baby died, whether stillborn, sickened, or simply unwanted, the court rarely held a funeral. There were no trumpets, no mourning crowds, no marble tombs etched with names, only whispers in hidden graves. In some cases, the infants were quietly taken from the birthing room and buried in the gardens of palaces beneath herbs. Behind chapels, under the stones, no one would think to question. A mound of earth, a quick prayer, and then forgotten. The monarchy could not afford too many public deaths. It weakened the illusion of divine favor. If it was a son, and a long-awaited one, they might declare him stillborn, only to hide the truth of deformity, disease, or suspicion. Some babies were never named. Some were named, then erased. Others were replaced, entirely swapped for lookalikes, to preserve a political alliance or cover up an affair. This was the quiet horror of royal motherhood. Not just the pain of childbirth, but the knowledge that your child's life or death would be used as strategy. Midwives were sworn to secrecy, servants bribed into silence, kings told to smile and try again. There are records, faint and fragmented, of infants baptized posthumously in royal ledgers, pages where ink was scraped off, dates that do not align, graves with no markings, letters hinting at births that were never declared, and deaths never grieved, because mourning was a luxury of the common folk. A queen's womb was state property, her sorrow an inconvenience. How many royal children lie under unmarked stones? How many mothers bled alone in rooms no longer remembered? How many kings were once boys who cried for a mother who wasn't allowed to hold them? And still, the ritual continued. The pageantry of pain, the silence of loss, decay, the myth of majesty. They called it a miracle when a son was born, but it wasn't God. They were thinking it was the queen's body. Her pain was patriotic, her blood political ink. Her womb was not hers, was the nation's altar, and every month it failed. To bloom was a national crisis. Behind every Tudor birth was a belief that power could be inherited like blood. The divine right could be sealed in flesh. But it also meant this: every woman of the crown was a hostage to her fertility. They were measured not by intellect or diplomacy, but by the swell of their belly, the wetness of their sheets. The survival of their sons was never part of the ritual. Neither was consent. And so the rituals grew crueler. Queens were told when to lie down, when to rise, what foods to eat, what prayers to chant, what sins to confess, just in case the unborn child was listening. If a miscarriage happened, it was her fault. If the baby died, it was her curse. If a girl was born, it was disappointment in pink silk. And if she could not conceive at all, she became disposable. Catherine of Aragon bled and prayed for years, only to be cast aside. Anne Boleyn gave England a brilliant daughter, but lost to sons that would have saved her neck. Jane Seymour died giving birth to the one heir Henry VIII worshipped. Each queen's body was a battlefield dressed in lace, but no matter how many died, the myth persisted. The myth that royal women were blessed, that palaces were safe, that crowns protected, that childbirth was holy and joyous. The truth, it was pain beneath pearls, screams behind curtains. A war waged with prayers and poison, betrayal and blood. What kind of power needs women to suffer in silence for it to survive? Even now, history paints them as lucky, privileged, protected. But behind the portraits, there are ghosts. Behind the myths, there are scars. Meet the golden cradle, there is always a shadow. There was a rule in the birthing chamber: no men allowed. But there was another rule, was spoken, deeper: no screaming. Not because the pain wasn't unbearable, not because it wasn't expected, but because the queen's agony, if heard, made the crown look fragile. So they trained them to weep quietly, to bite lace, to pray instead of cry. Because a royal birth was not a human event, it was a performance. And in performances, noise breaks illusion. Chambers were designed to be womb-like, dark, warm, sealed. No fresh air, no sharp light, no sudden movement. They believed it protected the child, but it also kept the queen prisoner. Days, sometimes weeks before labor, she was locked inside, surrounded by attendants and whispering midwives. She waited, not for joy, but for permission. Permission to prove her worth, to suffer correctly, to deliver the future without disturbing the present. And when the time came, she was not alone. Dozens of eyes, noble women, physicians, Sometimes entire courts watched her strain and bleed. They didn't come to help. They came to witness, to confirm that the heir was truly born of royal blood, that no switch had occurred, that no sorcery had tainted the bloodline. This was not childbirth. This was surveillance. And the queen, she was both sacred and suspect, a vessel with a crown, a body with duty but no privacy. Sometimes the child survived. Sometimes the queen did not. Often, both emerged broken, yet the chamber stayed silent. Always silent. What kind of society demands miracles to performs them? They called it sacred. They called it tradition. But behind the velvet curtains and perfumed prayers, there was something else. Fear. Fear that power could be undone by blood. That a woman's cry could unmask an empire. And so they silenced her. Not just in the chamber, but in the stories after. In Tudor England, a woman's body was not her own. It belonged first to her father, then to her husband. And if fate chose cruelly to the crown, but royalty twisted that fate into something even more monstrous. For queens, womanhood was never about freedom. It was about function, specifically fertility, the ability to bleed and breed on command. If she birthed a boy, she was a saint. If she miscarried, she was a curse. One drop of blood too early, and rumors would begin about witchcraft, divine punishment, or unfaithfulness. Because in a world where lineage meant legitimacy, the female body was both sacred and suspect, a walking paradox wrapped in silk. Some queens kept journals of their cycles. Others were inspected by physicians who touched them not as women, but as livestock. The womb is hostile. One courtier wrote of a barren queen as if the organ itself had political allegiance, and when a child was born female, silence would fill the room. Not grief, not hatred, just silence. It's the kind that falls over a failed harvest or a ruined treaty, because a daughter did not guarantee a throne. She guaranteed uncertainty. The court would smile. The king might kiss her forehead. But already, a plan was forming: marriage, alliance, transaction. Before the girl could even speak, her body had been mapped, measured, and sold. And yet, these women endured. Some carved power out of absence. Others played dumb, then pulled strings from the shadows. A few, very few, reigned in their own right. But most became myths or warnings. Their names erased. Their wombs remembered more than their words. What kind of power asks a woman to disappear in order to serve it? Tudor history tells of kings and sons and wars. But behind every heir, there is a woman who bled in silence, then vanished. And it is her absence that echoes loudest in the halls of power. The room was silent until the baby cried. And with that, cry sharper than any trumpet, more sacred than any hymn, politics began. Midwives clutched their rosaries. Nobles exhaled. Courtiers exchanged glances. Was it a boy, a future king, or a girl delicate, unarmored, politically inconvenient? Before the umbilical cord was even cut, the child's worth had been decided. In Tudor England, the birth of a royal heir was not a private affair. It was a spectacle, a gamble, a ceremony soaked in blood and bureaucracy. Dozens of witnesses might be summoned to watch, not to support the mother, but to confirm the legitimacy of the child. The queen's screams were background noise. The real focus was the infant's gender, lungs, claims to power. They wrapped the baby in silks, the color of dynastic ambition. Blue for hope, red for war, gold for legacy. The cradle was no longer a bed, it was a throne in waiting. Some newborns were paraded before courtiers like relics. Others were hidden away for weeks, their health or sex too delicate for public eyes. Rumors would slither through the palace walls like smoke. The boy has a twisted foot. The girl isn't breathing right. there was another child, stillborn in secret. What kind of dynasty weighs a soul by the shape of his genitals? Nurses were often spies in disguise, loyal not to the mother, but to the monarch. Even the baby's wet nurse could be replaced by decree. The queen's milk was political. If she chose to breastfeed, some saw it as holy, others weak. If she did not, it could be spun as selfishness or worse, suspicion. And when a son was born, celebrations echoed across kingdoms. Bells rang, cannons fired, wine flowed. But when a daughter emerged, joy was tempered. The crown would smile, but its eyes looked elsewhere. This was not family. This was legacy. And in the Tudor world, the bloodline mattered more than blood. They celebrated the cry, not the child. They say we are past those days, that the dark rituals of Tudor birth chambers are museum echoes, that we no longer whisper in incense and blood, but look closer. The ritual lives on only dressed in cleaner robes. Today, the scrutiny of royal mothers plays out on global screens, not behind velvet curtains, but behind hashtags. Instead of midwives, there are paparazzi. Instead of church bells, there are headlines. The waiting still happens. The gender still matters. The judgment is just digital now. Catherine, Meghan, Kate, they each stepped into that ancient theater. Eyes watched their wombs like sacred scrolls. Was the baby late? Why didn't she give birth naturally? What would the name signal to the public? Every ultrasound, every contraction, every moment of pain was still a performance, still political dot. And for the common woman, the peasant, the subject, the judgment remains, though the stakes are different. Hospitals now replace chambers, but the air still hums with fear. Is this child wanted? Is the father present? What kind of future will it inherit? The questions may be modern, okay, but they grow from Tudor roots. If you measure a mother by the child she bears, then you are still lighting candles at a Tudor altar. Surrogacy contracts, fertility scandals, gender reveals that become national news. Even now, birth is not just biology, it's spectacle. A woman's pain is still fodder for headlines. A child's arrival is still ranked by potential, by symbolism, or whether it serves the family myth. We have traded royal cradles for Instagram cribs, but the eyes watching are no less hungry. The Tudor birthing rituals may have faded from law, but they endure in obsession, in expectation, in the idea that a womb must serve something greater than a woman who carries it. The ritual never needed incense, only fear, tradition, and an audience. In the end, the Tudor birth chamber was not a place of life, it was a test, a ritual of survival. A theater of pain veiled in velvet. And every mother who entered it knew this was not just about a child, it was about power. For the crown, a son meant legacy, a daughter meant delay, a miscarriage meant scandal, a stillbirth meant suspicion. But no matter what emerged from her, the woman herself was always expendable. The mother was the means, not the story. She bled so the monarchy could breathe. That is the horror that lingers, not just in history books, but in the way we still watch women. The way we whisper when they are too old, too young, too bold. The way society still treats pregnancy as a performance, and pain as a price to be paid for public comfort. These rituals were not isolated. They were systemic, built into the architecture of courts, churches, and crowns. And they bled forward into every era that followed, into every society that dared to believe the birth of a ruler should be holy. Even if it left the mother in pieces. Some might ask, was it necessary? Was it divine? Was it simply the most polished form of cruelty disguised as tradition? History remembers kings, but it forgets the beds soaked in royal blood. If there is any legacy in these rituals, it is this, that we should never again build power on top of a woman's silence, okay? That no throne is worth a grave in its foundation, okay? And that no birth, no matter how royal, should demand the death of the one who gives it. So let the tapestries rot. Let the midwife's secrets echo. Let the incense drift into myth. But never forget what those rituals truly were. A crown dipped in blood. A crib carved from fear. A kingdom born screaming.